Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I didn't realize I was on mute. Alhamdulillah. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Good to see y'all. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum. Brother Frank, how you feeling?
Good.
Alhamdulillah. Good. Alhamdulillah. Good to see everyone. I'm gonna just pull up the YouTube just in case we have anybody watching who might be trying to communicate with us via YouTube, inshallah. Are we not streaming? Says we're streaming. Having trouble finding it though. Inshallah, maybe it'll pop up soon. Here we go. Alhamdulillah. Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وأزواج أمهات المؤمنين وذرياته وأهل البيت كما صليت على إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم إني أسألك من كل خير سألك من محمد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وأعوذ بك من كل شر استعاذك من محمد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. اللهم اغفر لنا ما قدمنا وما أخرنا وما أسررنا وما أعلنا وما أنت أعلم منا. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من فتنة المحيا والممات ومن فتنة القبر ومن فتنة المسيح الدجال ومن عذاب النار وسوء المصير. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد رضي الله عن أصحاب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. يا همة الشيخ احضري يا به المحضر ولتأتي بنظرة تأتينا بالأمر. أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to our weekly Maliki Fiqh class. We're gonna start, inshallah, right away because we're gonna try to end it just around 10 o'clock, inshallah ta'ala. Oh, subhanAllah, we got people in the waiting room. Bismillah. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the folks who just joined us. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum, Uncle. How you doing, Uncle Yahya?
I'm good. Thank Allah, man. Allah's merciful, man. We having some really nice weather down here, so just trying to get ready for this Ramadan, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah. I appreciate. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I hear in Cali we got some pretty good weather as well. Alhamdulillah. I got the way it's set up on my screen. I got my Uncle Yahya on my right, my Uncle Frank on my left. So this is perfect. Alhamdulillah. I feel like I'm at 96th Street.
Oh my God.
Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Danielle. Thank you as well for turning on your camera. Huh? Oh, you're gonna mute. Alhamdulillah. So we're gonna open up, inshallah ta'ala, with a hadith. And this hadith, there's a lot of different versions of this hadith and different ahadith that have the same meaning. Oh, and let me say this too, for people who may be new and have not heard me say it before. So whenever I open up the class, the du'as that you hear me make, it's a series of du'a. The first.
And we are live.
Oh, what's that?
Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Peace, greetings to everyone who has joined us here today. Welcome to Umi's Archive, a 6-part online exhibition drawing the life of my Umi, Amina Amatul Haq, to create a space where we can remember and dream.
So that actually was, I did not mean to play that, but that is a good friend of mine, a sister by the name of Dr. Suwad Abdul Khabir, who has an awesome project she did called Umi's Archive. So since that just broke through, I'll take the opportunity to mention that and encourage people to go check that out if you're interested, if you just look up Umi's Archive. But the hadith, inshallah ta'ala, that we want to read today. I'm sorry. So the du'as that I make when I open the class, I always start with al-Fatiha and Salatul Fatih, which is a prayer on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That I like to do. Many people of the Tijani way say this one often, but it's not just for Tijanis. A lot of people say this prayer on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and there's different history to it. If you look into the tafsir of Ibn Kathir, there is an account where someone came to our leader Ali radiallahu anhu, the Khalifa, the 4th Khalifa after the Prophet ﷺ returned to Allah, and asked him for the best way to send prayers on the Prophet ﷺ. And he responded with a very long prayer on the Prophet ﷺ with a lot of different dimensions to it. And actually, I don't remember if the person asked for the best way to send prayers on the Prophet ﷺ or asked some other question, but was asking about advice on making dua. And Imam Ali gave this long, prayer. And in it, you find a section of it, which is essentially Salatul Fatih, almost word for word, with just a couple of differences. And then later, there was a scholarly person who was descended from Sayyidina Abu Bakr. This is many, many years later, hundreds of years later, who made dua and asked Allah to show him the best way to send prayers on the Prophet ﷺ. And he had a dream. And in a dream, he saw this prayer, Salatul Fatih, in a sheet of light, which is very close to the words from this prayer that Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu shared with the people during his time, that's reported in the tafsir of Ibn Kathir. So there's a prayer on the Prophet ﷺ that people like to do. Certain people, like I said, people of the Tijani way and people of Tasawwuf in different parts of the world are fond of this prayer on the Prophet ﷺ. So always open up with Fatiha and Salatul Fatih, and then with the Atashahud from the Salah, so that our ears can get used to it. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina Muhammadan nabiyil ummi wa azwajihi ummahatil mu'minin wa dhurriyyati wa ahlil bayt kama sallaytu ala Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. This is one prayer on the Prophet ﷺ that you can say in your salah after the Atashahud. This is the prayer on the Prophet ﷺ that Sheikh Amin taught us from Dr. Dunya to say in the salah. But you could also say, instead of that, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaytu ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma barik ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. So if you're used to saying that in your salat, that's fine. That there's a lot of ahadith behind that one. So I say the Atashahud, and then I say the prayers on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then the du'as that we received in the hadith and that we have in the book we're studying, that you can say after the prayers on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the salah. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaytu ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma barik ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. اللهم إني أسألك من كل خير سألك من محمد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وأعوذ بك من كل شر استعاذك من محمد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. اللهم اغفر لنا ما قدمنا وما أخرنا وما أسررنا وما أعلنا وما أنت أعلم منا. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من فتنة المحيا والممات ومن فتنة القبر ومن فتنة المسيح الدجال ومن عذاب النار وسوء المصير. I know I said that very fast. We'll come to a place in the book where we'll break it down a little slower. I think there actually might be a YouTube recording of going through it a little bit slower. But that's how I open the class. And then after that, I say a dua that Sheikh Ibrahim Nias, may Allah be pleased with him, would often say before he would speak in public, where he would say, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, radiyallahu anna ashabi Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So prayers on the Prophet, and then asking Allah's pleasure to be upon the Sahabas of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-ali al-azim. This is from Quran. There's no might nor power except by Allah. the most high, the most awesomeness hadith about this dhikr. And then we make a brief dua where we say, Ya himmat al-shaykh, uhdurina bihal mahdar wal ta'tafi bi nadratin ta'tidina bi dhafar. Now, this is something that, may be controversial in some circles, right? It is a dua essentially asking Allah to assist us because of our love for the Shaykh, right? Our love for our Shaykh. In this case, I'm referring to Shaykh Ahmed Tijani. And of course, as I've said before, this class isn't just for Tijanis, right? So this isn't something that everybody has to engage in, but it's a dua that I make asking Allah to assist me out of my love for Shaykh Ahmed Tijani, for the sake of his strong himmah, his strong devotion and commitment to serving Allah. And this is from a genre of dua called Istirata. Right. Assalamu alaikum, Dad. This is my pops in the room. Assalamu alaikum, Dad. How you doing? Alhamdulillah. But Istirata literally means to seek help, right? And you'll find that some folks, particularly people who, people who often refer to themselves as Salafi, will say, this is problematic because it's like you're seeking help from someone other than Allah, right? But traditionally, most of the scholars of Ahlul Sunnah and of the Muslim world in general have said that these kind of du'as are fine to do. And they have proof, they have evidences from the hadith where people would sort of seek a means to Allah through a person, maybe asking a certain person to make dua for them, or even after that person passed away, asking Allah to bless them for the sake of their relationship to that person. So it's something that there's proof for. And my understanding, my position, what I've learned from my teachers is that it's only problematic if a person thinks that there's some kind of help that can arrive to them independent of Allah, right? This would be shirk. This would be, putting a partner with Allah. But if you recognize that, the one that you're seeking help and benefit from is Allah, right? But you're asking Allah to bless you, bijahi Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, perhaps because of your relationship to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for the sake of you being from the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or for the sake of your love for a particular servant of Allah who was known to do good works and live a good life, right? This is permissible. It's a form of humility, right? In a way of approaching our Lord in a humble way, right? And I say all this just because I want to be clear to you all about what I'm saying, right? I've seen people make these kind of du'as and they'll kind of make it under their breath, right? So as not to be controversial. And me personally, I want you to know what I'm saying, and I also want to let you know that this is something that in certain circles, people will may have a problem with, right? So I'm not telling you that for you to go and cause a problem with them and make fitna. If somebody doesn't want to make this kind of dua, they don't have to, right? But I also want you to know that there's a basis for it, right? This isn't something that we're just doing because we don't care about the Sharia or anything like that. We're going to talk a little bit more about some related issues in a moment. But I also want to point out that, this term istighatha, if you ever do get into a discussion about it with other people, oftentimes people think that istighatha, they define istighatha as calling on a person other than Allah, right? Like you'll hear du'as where people say something like, Ya Sheikh such and such, right? And the books of the scholars of Ahlul Sunnah, many of them, they say that this is permissible as long as someone has the right aqidah. They know they're not calling on this person because they think this person can help them, right? They're calling on this person to be a sort of intercessor, right? To ask Allah on their behalf. The same way I might say, Brother Frank or Brother Yahya, make dua for me, right? That even if a person has returned to Allah, we know from the various ahadith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us know that the people that are beloved to him, when they return to Allah, it's not like they're gone and they don't exist anymore. No, they're with Allah. They still have the ability to make dua, intercede for people if Allah gives them that right, that ability. But even with that, though I will say that my understanding is that is permissible, that's not something I do. the form of istiratha that you'll find that I do is maybe we'll make istiratha. And another word that's different but has a related similar meaning is tawassul. We'll make istiratha or tawassul through an act of ibadah, right? Through a verse of Quran, right? We're seeking Allah's help, seeking a means of closeness to Allah through his word, through ibadah. And the one dua that you'll hear me say that may somewhat resemble this is Ya Himmat Shaykh. But even then, we're not saying, oh Shaykh, we're saying, oh, the commitment of the Shaykh. It's like we're asking Allah to assist us with the kind of fervor and commitment and zeal that the Shaykh had, in serving his Lord. So it's a way of hopefully inspiring us, as well as asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to support us and assist us as a result of our connection to and love for the Shaykh. And I find it very interesting that when Sheikh Ibrahim did it, he said prayers on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then radiallahu anhum, ask Allah to be pleased with all his companions and all the Prophet's companions. Then he said, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Make it clear, no might, no power except from Allah. And then he would say, Ya himmat shaykh, right? Not Ya Shaykh, but Ya himmat shaykh. Like, by the, sort of, there's another word I'm trying to think of that some people translate himma as, but sort of commitment, devotion, of the Shaykh, be present with us, right? So this is a dua that Sheikh Ibrahim used to do and that I do. And I just say that so that you all know what we're doing. Alhamdulillah. Now with that, I want to read this hadith, inshallah ta'ala. And this is a hadith about the subject of bid'ah. And bid'ah is an Arabic word that means innovation. And as I said before, there's a lot of different versions of this hadith. The version I'm about to read here comes from Sahih Bukhari. And it's, I'll read it in English. On the authority of our mother, the mother of the faithful, Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, who said, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the one who innovates something in this matter of ours, meaning in this deen, in this religion, in this way of life, the one who innovates something in this matter of ours that is not of it will have it rejected. And then in another version, it reads, the one who does an act which we have not commanded, we will have it rejected. So all of this is talking about, bid'ah, right? This is talking about people who innovate a matter in the religion. And you'll hear this oftentimes in the khutbah on Fridays. You'll hear the khatib will say, anyone who innovates, a matter in religion, the innovation is misleading and it leads to the hellfire, right? So I want to talk a little bit about what that is and what that means. And I am pulling from a work by Imam Nawawi called Al-Maqasid, which is pretty easy to find online. But in it, he has a discussion where he talks about innovation. And Sheikh Ibrahim radiallahu anhu says something very similar to what's in this book in some of his writings. But I found it in an older work from Imam Nawawi. So I wanted to share this. Allahumma salli wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Okay. And so the gist of it, to be, to try to make it somewhat brief, he talks about different categories of innovation. So what is an innovation? Innovation is when somebody introduces something new, right? And pretty much all the scholars from every way of life, every way of thought, every walk of life agree that this hadith doesn't mean that we should avoid all types of innovation. For instance, you have innovation in science, innovation in medicine, innovation in travel. The telephone is an innovation. You can use all of that, right? But they say it's regarding innovation in religion, right? But if we, and this is something that, part of the reason I share this and I want to talk about this is because some of you may come into conflict with people around this. There's people who, they're always saying that everything is bid'ah. You know, this is bid'ah, that's bid'ah, everybody's doing bid'ah, and they're quick to sort of weaponize this hadith to, you know, try to disturb people. They'll say things like, why are you using a tasbih? That's bid'ah, right? There could be, you know, things like this. But if we have a firm understanding, we'll hopefully be able to avoid, you know, all of that fitna and drama. So when we talk about bid'ah, when we talk about innovation, right? If we dig a little deeper and we look at the different debates that the scholars have had over the course of the last couple hundred years, you'll find that there are many things that are innovations, that are new things that people use to do ibadah that nobody is challenging. During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, when the Muslims made sajda on the ground, they didn't have no rugs, right? Putting the carpet on the floor in the masjid is an innovation. It is a type of bid'ah, right? Using the microphone to call the adhan, right? Type of bid'ah. Sayyidina Bilal radiallahu anhu didn't have no microphone when he stood on top of the Kaaba, right? Using the microphone to listen to Quran or to hear the Imam. This is an innovation. Using audio devices like the tape recorder or the record player or your phone to listen to the Quran. This is an act of ibadah, and this is an innovation, right? All of these are innovations, but they're not innovations that are haram. They're not the kinds of innovations that the Prophet ﷺ was referring to when he talked about bid'ah, right? And there's other versions of the hadith that say, you know, all innovations are cursed. But what innovations are they talking about? So Imam Nawawi, rahmatullahi alayhi, gives us a good explanation, a nice, thorough explanation about this. And like I said, I'm gonna try to, you know, kind of read just some sections of it because it's a little bit long and I don't want to take up too much time. And I just closed it, so I got to reopen it. And basically, Imam Nawawi, rahmatullahi, he categorizes bid'ah, innovation, into 5 different categories. And these 5 different categories correspond with the categories that we use in fiqh to determine the status of a matter. So in fiqh, we learn that everything can be categorized as, you know, being either wajib or mandatory, right? Or it can be categorized as being mustahab, meaning something that's not mandatory, something that you will not be punished for omitting, but something that's pleasing to Allah and you will be rewarded if you do, right? That's mustahab. Or makruh, right? A makruh, something that's makruh is something that is disliked, meaning it's not haram, but you will be rewarded if you leave it for the pleasure of Allah because it's disliked, even though it's haram. Or you have things that are haram, which are forbidden. If you do them, then you'll be accountable for that. You know, Allah can punish you for that. He may punish you for that, you know, or in the books of fiqh, they say he will punish you for that, because that should be our attitude, that if we commit sin, you know, we don't know if Allah is going to give us the chance to repent and if he's going to forgive us. So we treat it as something that we're going to be punished for. And then the 5th category is they use the word mubah, or sometimes you'll hear in other madhahib, other madhabs, they'll use the word jaiz. And even in some of the Maliki texts, they'll say jaiz, but this means something that's neutral, something that's just halal, basically, something that's permissible. You know, Sheikh Amin used to tell us nothing is really neutral. Everything is either pleasing to Allah or displeasing to Allah, depending on the intention behind it, depending on how you went about doing it, right? But, you know, it is important for you to know this category, mubah, as something that is mentioned in the books of fiqh. So what does Imam Nawawi rahmatullahi say about bid'ah? He says that you have different types of innovation. He says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, beware of matters newly begun, for every innovation is misguidance. He says, beware of matters newly begun. And then he goes on to quote some different scholars. He quotes a scholar named Muhammad al-Jordani, who says that this means you should distance yourself from and be wary of matters that are newly innovated, that did not previously exist. In other words, things that are invented in Islam that contravene or go against the Sharia, right, the sacred law. And he goes on to, you know, quote the hadith, for every innovation is misguidance, meaning, and he explains, meaning that every innovation is the opposite of truth, i.e. it is falsehood. A hadith that has been related elsewhere says, for every newly matter begun is innovation, every innovation is misguidance, and every misguidance is in hell. Meaning that everyone who is misguided, whether through themselves or by following another, is in hell. The hadith referring to matters that are not good innovations, the hadith referring to matters that are not good innovations with a basis in the Sharia, right? So this is where he's starting to make a distinction, that there's some innovations that are good innovations that have a basis in the Sharia. And he says it has been stated that innovations fall under 5 headings of the sacred law, the 5 headings of the sacred law: obligatory, unlawful, recommended, offensive, and permissible. Obligatory, unlawful, recommended, offensive, and permissible. In other words, wajib or fard, haram, mustahab, makruh, and mubah or permissible, right? And I'll just read a little bit from his description. He says, the first category comprises innovations that are obligatory. What kind of innovation could possibly be obligatory, right? Is a question we may ask. Well, Imam Nawawi tells us, such as recording the Quran and laws of Islam in writing when it was feared that something might be lost from them. So even compiling the Quran in written form in one full book is something that didn't happen during the time of the Prophet ﷺ in this kind of standard codified book text. So that's an innovation, but it's what they call a bid'ah hasana, right? And even this terminology of bid'ah hasana, a good innovation, is something that can be traced at least as far back as Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu during his lifetime, because during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the one year during Ramadan, the Prophet ﷺ came out and led his night prayers in the masjid. And then the second time he did it again and people followed him. And the third time he did it again and more people followed him. And after that, he didn't do it anymore, right? Because he didn't want people to think that this was something that was mandatory. But then when Sayyidina Umar, right, Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiallahu anhu, when he was in charge of the Muslims, he reinstated this. He innovated it. He said, we're going to go back to doing what the Prophet ﷺ did those first 3 nights, right? And this is what we call Taraweeh. Right? During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it wasn't his habit to make Taraweeh, right? But we make it every year during Ramadan. And it's a good thing. And it is said that Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, he came into the masjid and he saw the people making Taraweeh, and he said, "Hada bid'ah hasana." He said, this is a good innovation, right? So Imam Nawawi says things like recording, writing down the Quran, writing down hadith, the laws of Islam, Sharia in writing, so that they won't be lost. This is a bid'ah. But it's a mandatory bid'ah, an obligatory bid'ah, an innovation that had to be done to protect the sunnah, right? And he says the study of the disciplines of Arabic that are not necessary to understand the Quran and sunnah, such as grammar, such as word declination, this is what they call sarf, and lexicography, hadith classification, saying this hadith is sahih, this hadith is hasan, is good, this hadith is da'if, is weak, this hadith is ma'dur, is fabricated. This is something that the Prophet ﷺ did not ever explicitly say. So this is a bid'ah, right? So hadith classification to distinguish between genuine and spurious prophetic traditions and the philosophical refutations of arguments put forward by, we'll just say, heterodox groups, right? So there's another good or necessary innovation, according to Imam Nawawi, when the scholars started to come with responses to people who had weird ideas, right, or ideas that were incorrect about belief. They came up with this, they innovated and sort of expounded on the science of what is called aqidah or kalam to be able to refute those things and help bring people back to proper belief. These are all necessary innovations, bid'ah, wajib, bid'ah wajiba. And then the second category is the unlawful innovations, right? So what's an unlawful innovation? This is the bid'ah that we say leads to the hellfire, the bid'ah that the Prophet ﷺ warned us of. And he gives the example of unlawful innovations are things like non-Islamic taxes and levies that exceed the amount necessary to prevent public detriment. So if you got a ruler, and this is important because one of the things that I always like to kind of go back to is, what's the benefit? What's the point? The Prophet ﷺ told us to avoid innovations, right? Is it just kind of like a, just as simple. I mean, it is as simple as saying the Prophet ﷺ told us to avoid it. We avoid it. But, you know, what does that mean, practically speaking, in our life? What things should we avoid, right? So they mention here, or Imam Nawawi mentions here, one example he gives is, you know, sort of unjust and extreme taxation of a Muslim ruler. This is a bid'ah. This is a haram innovation, right? And this is the kind of thing that governments, even some governments that are ran by people who are, you know, supposedly Muslim, do. Another thing he says is giving positions of authority and sacred law to those unfit for them. So to put somebody who has bad character or who hasn't studied properly, you know, to put them in a position where they're leading and guiding the other Muslims that could potentially misguide them and not be able to help them, you know, correct their practice and their actions. Or they could even be, you know, a person who maybe has knowledge but bad character and could use that position to actually oppress the people. To put someone like that in a position of authority is a bid'ah. That's haram, right? Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everyone. For those who just joined us, we're reading from Imam Nawawi's work where he classifies the different. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everybody. Alhamdulillah. For people who just jumped in, we're reading through Imam Nawawi's description of innovation, of bid'ah, and he categorizes the bid'ah into 5 types. There's some bid'ah that is obligatory. There's some bid'ah that is haram. There's some bid'ah that is recommended. There's some bid'ah that is disliked. And then there's some bid'ah that is just permissible, right? And this is important because when people talk about the hadith, how every innovation is misleading and leads to the hellfire, it's important to know what kind of innovations that the Prophet ﷺ was referring to, right? And the scholars have let us know. They don't mean, for instance, wearing a t-shirt, wearing a hoodie, right? The Prophet ﷺ didn't wear a hoodie. That doesn't mean it's haram. They don't mean listening to the Quran, you know, on your phone or on a record player, right? This is an innovation. In this case, it's an innovation in worship, right? Listening to the Quran is a form of worship. Using the microphone to call the adhan is a form of worship. But these are not haram innovations. Using the tasbih, the dhikr beads. The Prophet ﷺ never used any dhikr beads, but this is not a haram innovation. So we're going to continue through reading what Imam Nawawi says. He mentions first the necessary innovations, things like writing down the Quran, writing down the sacred law, studying Arabic grammar, right? Then he talks about the haram innovation, things like unjust and extreme taxes, right? Things like putting a person who's not qualified in a position of religious authority, right? Religious authority, right? Doesn't mean that, you know, if a person, you know, votes or something, that's haram. And some people, you know, that's a different conversation. Not saying that that's something we should or shouldn't do. That's a different conversation for a different time, but that's not what they're talking about here. Devoting one's time to learning the beliefs of heretical sects that contravene the tenets of faith. So they say here that one of the things Imam Nawawi says is a haram innovation is to spend all your time learning what the people who have it incorrect have to say about belief, right? The people who don't have proper belief, what do they say about Allah? What do they say about theology? And they don't say it here, but the exception is the person who's studying those things for the purpose of trying to help correct people's beliefs. So if you're somebody who's studying to be a scholar, to be a teacher, even not even necessarily a scholar, but just to have enough knowledge to be able to maybe even help your family, you know, correct maybe some problems in their belief. This is a reason why you can study this stuff. But to just spend all your time studying, you know, what people who have incorrect belief have said about belief for no beneficial reason is one of the things that Imam Nawawi says is a haram bid'ah. Another thing we can say is anything that changes, you know, the acts of worship that we have a clear instruction about how to do from the sunnah. So for instance, if somebody popped up and said, I'm gonna make 5 rak'ah in Salatul Subh and Salatul Fajr, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, Subh, Fajr is 2 rak'ah. Somebody said, well, if I want to make 5 because I figure if I do more, that'll give me more benefit. That is a haram bid'ah. That's an innovation. That's the kind of bid'ah we want to avoid, right? Somebody say, we're going to do Jummah on Wednesday. right? Or we're going to do Juma on Sunday because that's when we got off from school, from work, right? That would be a bid'ah. That'd be innovation. You know what I'm saying? So these are things that we understand are, haram innovations. Walaikum salam, welcome. We're talking about innovations, bid'ah, and the ways that the scholars classify different types of bid'ah. We often hear that bid'ah is haram, bid'ah leads to the hellfire, and this is a sound hadith. But the scholars have explained that when the Prophet ﷺ said that, he wasn't referring to every kind of innovation, right? And so we're reading Imam Nawawi's text where he's explaining the different categories. So we talked about the type of bid'ah that is necessary, like recording the Quran on paper, the type of bid'ah that is haram, like unjust taxes, putting an unjust or unqualified person in a position of religious authority. And I added something like changing the form of the prayer intentionally, saying I'm going to make Asr as 10 rak'ah, right? This is a bid'ah, right? This is haram. Then the third category, and in addition, we can say anything that sort of just changes the Sharia, right, to that point. So if somebody comes and says, you can eat pork now because, now we got modern methods of refrigeration and we can cook the pork and it's not going to get you sick. That's a bid'ah. The Prophet says on the Quran says, khanzir, the pork is haram, right? So if somebody were to say, okay, you can eat it now, this is a bid'ah, this is a haram innovation. I'll give this quick example. There's a sister who's a secular scholar, academic scholar. She's not a religious scholar, but she has some academic scholarship, who said that she was going to, she started, I don't know if I want to say a movement, but she began to start a practice where she said women can lead men in prayer, right? The women can lead the men in prayer. Now, what's interesting is there's difference of opinion about that among the scholars. Some of the scholars will say that if you got a woman and she's married to a man, and maybe the man just became Muslim, and the woman is more knowledgeable of Quran, more knowledgeable of Islam, more knowledgeable about the prayer, then she can lead her husband in prayer. That's an opinion. It's not everyone's opinion, but it's an opinion from among the opinions of the scholars, right? There's also, and part of this comes from a report that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was a woman who was the most knowledgeable person in her household, and she led the people of her household in prayer. So this might have been like servants, children, perhaps, I don't know all the context of who was in a household, but perhaps her husband, right? So there's a basis for that. But when this sister came and said, I'm saying that women can lead men in prayer, that men and women can pray together, right? And women can, and a woman can lead everybody in prayer. She didn't say there's a basis in the Sunnah, and based on that, we think, we should implement this practice, right? If she said that, I would disagree, but we could say there's a basis for what she's doing. She said, nobody's ever done this before. This is the first time a woman has led men in prayer, and this is what I'm encouraging people to do, right? So she basically said, we're going to innovate. We're going to do a bid'ah. We don't want to take care to make sure that we're doing something that's in accordance with what the Prophet ﷺ did and the scholarly tradition that preserved the Sunnah. She said, no, I just think that we need to do it different than what the Prophet ﷺ did. And so we're going to do it like this now. That's a bid'ah. That's an innovation, right? So anything that changes the Sharia, this is that kind of haram bid'ah that we have to avoid, right? And part of the reason I use this example is to get you thinking that sometimes it's not just the action, it's the process that is used to arrive at the decision about the action. That has to be taken into account too, right? That has to be taken into account too. I don't know if this is a great example, but just to give example to make it hopefully a little bit more clear, we know that the Prophet ﷺ said that you can pray Dhuhr 2 rak'ah and Asr 2 rak'ah when you're traveling, right? When you have when you meet certain qualifications as a traveler, you can shorten your Dhuhr prayer, shorten your Asr prayer, shorten your Isha prayer, right? But let's say a person didn't know that. And a person said, well, I just feel like it's a lot to try to make these 4 rak'ah when I'm traveling. They never knew anything about the hadith. They didn't know anything about the ruling that says you can shorten your prayers as a traveler. They just decided to do it because they felt it was the thing to do. This would be a bid'ah. Even though the action is actually an acceptable action, right? Because they didn't base it on trying to ground it in the Sharia and reconcile it with the Sharia, this is what would make it a bid'ah. Does that make sense? People understand what I'm saying? Okay. I see Sister Zainab has her hand up. Assalamu alaikum.
Well, I do have a question about that. So if I'm traveling, right, and I have a layover, and the layover is like 12 hours or 16 hours. So technically I'm traveling, but I'm like, oh, okay, I can just make the full prayer. Would that be considered haram? Like I should just be making the two?
Right. So I'm not going to say it's haram. I don't know if people would say it's haram or not. And Imam Malik, rahmatullah, sometimes he didn't always say this is haram. This is, sometimes he would say, I don't like that, right?
Yeah.
If a person is a traveler and they choose to pray their prayer 4 rakah when they have the right to make it 2 rakah, the prayer is accepted. The prayer is valid, right? But you're discouraged from doing that. So I might say it's maybe makruh. Why? Because the opportunity to shorten your prayer is like a gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you to make things easier for you, right? So to just kind of, throw that gift away, just because you feel like because a person feels like, okay, well, I can do more, so I want to do more. This is actually would be seen as bad etiquette, right? What you could do, however, is shorten your prayer 2 rakah, for Dhuhr and Asr while you have that layover and you're counted as a traveler. But if you have extra time, say, I know some airports, they have like a musalla in the airport. So if you want to make some nafila, if you want to make some extra rakah, you can do that. You can make 10 rakah nafila, right? While you're waiting in the airport, you can make 2 rakah dhuhr and then make as much nafila as you want, and then make 2 rakah asr and then go get on your plane, right? You can do that. But it would be better for you to shorten the dhuhr and the asr and the isha when you're a traveler, because this is from the sunnah. This is what the Prophet ﷺ used to do. And this is something that is an allowance that Allah gives us to make it easy for us. So we want to have the right etiquette to not throw that gift away. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I just always thought about it. They were shortening prayers during like wartime. So it's like, oh, okay, I can pray.
Right. No, I get it. That makes that I definitely
that makes
sense.
sense.
Yeah. But the Prophet ﷺ didn't only shorten his prayers during wartime. He would shorten his prayers when he was on a journey, that even if the journey wasn't particularly arduous, from my understanding, the hadith indicate that this was just his common practice as a way to show us that even if the journey isn't especially arduous, you still, have this allowance that Allah has given us to make it easy for us.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Frank.
Walaikum salam. My wife has a question.
Sure. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I have a question. The Surat An-Nisa, ayah 59, it says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu wa ati'ullah wa ati'ur rasul wa ulil amri minkum. And when my question, some people has argue about this, about there are hadith about if the government comes with a whip and you are whipped, then you must remain obedient to the government. Is bid'ah or it's correct?
Alhamdulillah. That's a great question. And I'm going to try my best to give you an answer, but this is a question that, big people that people have a lot more knowledge than me have debated about, right? But and just so that everybody understands, the verse that she's referring to, it says, it translates as, let me pull it up. Here we go. O believers, obey Allah and obey the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and those in authority among you. Should you disagree on anything, then defer it to Allah and His Messenger if you truly believe in Allah and the last day. This is the best and the fairest resolution. So this wording, ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum, right? Those who, ulil amri minkum means those who are in authority among you, right? Or you can say in authority over you. So who are these people that Allah is telling us we have to obey, right? So some say that this includes the government. And they say this includes the government because if you oppose the government, then there'll be chaos, right? Some say this does not necessarily mean the government, right? This is talking about the people of religious knowledge, people of religious authority, the ulama, the shuyukh, right? The people who, men and women can be people in this, who have a level of religious authority too, through their learning. So in other words, you know, if the scholars say that a certain thing is permissible or a certain thing is haram or what have you, and they're the qadi, maybe the Islamic judge or something like that, then you should obey them. You shouldn't, you know, oppose them because they have more knowledge and they have this permission, right? And there's other hadith that talk about this, how the scholar has a certain permission where even if they make a mistake, if their intention was correct and they went through the proper process to arrive at a ruling, then inshallah, they're going to be forgiven for the mistake and you'll be forgiven for following them. But if you don't have that level of learning and you don't have that level of authority in an Islamic society where, you know, you have an Islamic judge who gives the ruling, you don't have the right to say, I don't like that judge's ruling, right? You know, maybe there may be some situations where you have multiple judges who you could go to, but you need to defer to the authority of the people who have that permission and the people who have that religious learning, right? So some people say that doesn't have anything to do with the government. And then there's a third position, which I guess I kind of incline to, which is that it can extend to the government, right? In a couple of different cases. One, if the government is a legitimate government, a government that, you know, that Islam sort of, you know, gives legitimacy to. And I don't know that there's any government today that falls under that category, right? But if you lived in a society where, you know, you had a Muslim ruler, you know, or even a non-Muslim ruler who made it a point to give the Muslims the freedom to practice their religion. Like we have the first example of the Ethiopian ruler, Muhammad al-Najashi, the Najashi in Ethiopia, who was Christian, even though he eventually took Shahada, but at the time was Christian, but, you know, let the Muslims live under his jurisdiction. And in West Africa, we have a lot of examples of this, where West African rulers, when Islam was still young in West Africa, West African rulers who weren't anti-Islam, who said, we like Islam, so we'll give the Muslims the free reign to be able to govern themselves and have self-determination, right? Another time when I would say this could apply to the government is if we say that, and this is where, for me, it gets kind of tricky, right? So I guess another way to pose the question is it permissible for a Muslim to oppose the government? And the answer that I've gotten from my teachers is that, yes, it is, but you have to take into account what is the fallout going to be, right? If you opposing the government is just going to lead to a bunch of people being killed and having chaos, then it's haram for you to oppose the government.
Even the government is anti-Muslim.
Even if the government is anti-Muslim, but then it becomes, what's the specific situation? Because let's say, for instance, the government tells you don't pray, right? You go in your house, you make salat. You should do that. You should oppose the government, right? But should you now go and fight the government to destroy the government, to put a new government in place? Well, if you're going to do that, you got to make sure you have the ability to win, right? And I give you the example. I asked, you know, my teacher, my Sheikh Muhammad Umayyad Sisi, and this is maybe a good lesson. This was during the time of what they call the Arab Spring, which happened, you know, just a few years ago, when you had a lot of different movements in Arab countries of people who opposing the government, and they were opposing the government in nonviolent ways. They weren't trying to have a coup. They weren't, trying to violently overthrow they were just demonstrating, marching in the streets, which I will say, my understanding is this is permissible. This is permissible. This kind of like what they call in America, civil disobedience, permissible. You're not doing anything that's going to hurt anybody, right? That's my understanding. This is something that scholars have different debates and opinions of. So you don't have to take my understanding as the only one, but that's my understanding, right? But all of the big Sunni ulama in a lot of these Muslim countries were saying, no, you can't oppose the government. These protesters are like dogs and they should be killed, right? Which made a lot of us uncomfortable, me included, made me uncomfortable. So I once asked Sheikh Mai, I said, Sheikh, I was going to ask him, why is it not permissible to oppose the government, right? That was going to be my question. So I said, Sheikh, okay. Okay, I'll come to those questions, inshallah. But I said, Sheikh, I understand you can't fight the government. And I was going to say, why? And he said, no, that's not the case. It's not the case that you just can never fight the government. And I said, okay. And he began to explain to me. He said, he gave the example of Libya. He said, Libya had a ruler, Muammar Gaddafi, who, some people like Gaddafi because he gave a lot of money to African nations, right? He even gave money to groups like the Black Panther Party and the Nation of Islam in America, right? But other people didn't like Gaddafi because he did some very repressive things to his people in Libya, right? Sheikh Mai's response, so he gave that example because he said, even if you take the position that Gaddafi was no good, right? If you look at what they have in Libya today, it's far worse than what was happening when Gaddafi was in power. Now you just have a country in chaos, right? Now you just have people dying. It's lawless. It's very bad, right? And so to oppose Gaddafi in that situation was haram because we see what it produced. But then he gave the example of a scholar from northern Nigeria in the 18th century named Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio. May Allah be pleased with him. He said Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio was writing books about government, about economics, about all these subjects. And then people said, why are you writing books about these subjects when we don't have an Islamic state, an Islamic society? And then he had a revolution and he established an Islamic society in northern Nigeria, right? So this gets really tricky because, there's not a one solid answer for every situation. If the government is telling you can't practice your religion, you have the right to oppose the government, and you should oppose the government. If the government is telling you don't fast on Ramadan, don't listen to them. Fast. The government is telling you don't make salat, don't listen. Make salat, right? But do you have the right to, and do you have the right to try to change the government? If there's peaceful ways that you can try to change the government, my understanding is that that's permissible, right? But do you have the right to actually violently try to overthrow the government? Well, that depends on a lot of different factors. I would say usually no, because usually all you're going to do is create more conflict. But if you have a situation where you have a group of people who have the ability to establish an orderly Islamic society, right? Like Sheikh Uthman, and we don't really have this today, right? You don't really have this today, right? So if you hear people saying, well, most people who are saying this stuff today, they're like criminal people, right? But, if the question is, do you have the right to disobey the government if they're trying to keep you from practicing your religion? Do you have the right to protest if the government is an oppressive government? Yes, you have the right to protest. You have the right to, do different things. Like maybe if you don't like the government runs the school, you can try to build your own school, right? Maybe if the government tries to shut your school down, you can protest. You can do things to try to keep your school open, right? That you have the right to do. But to actually like create a war situation, that is something that, generally speaking, you shouldn't do. And there are exceptions to that, and the scholarly people can have discussions about when there's an exception to that. I don't know of any situation today of people who, you know, are legitimately trying to, like, you know, do that kind of, you know, those kind of actions. But does that answer your question? It's a big question. So
point is, if the government comes with whip and you are whipped, then you must remain obedient to the government. Is that bid'ah or sahih?
Well, so who is that statement attributed to?
Well, a lot of people, a pro-government who zalim in my country.
Yeah.
This hadith.
Yeah. So is it a hadith that's saying that this is from the Prophet? Like something he said this?
I don't know. They like manhaj. I don't know. This is what the debate.
Yeah.
They, my country is Muslim country, but is anti.
Right. Yeah. To me, that sounds like, I don't know that hadith, right? So I can't say that it's sound or not. I don't think that, I've never heard that as a sound hadith. I've heard people say that, but I don't think it comes from the Prophet. I don't know. I don't, but I think it's, that's why I was asking you, is it a hadith or is it just a saying that's attributed to some scholar, right?
It says the scholar, probably not scholar. I'm not sure if it's a true scholar.
Because if it's attributed to a scholar, then you have to put it in context. Maybe that's what the scholar felt was the best thing for the people to hear at that time. That doesn't mean that that's the right approach for every situation, right? Like there was a scholar in Syria named Sheikh Ramadan al-Bouti. May Allah be pleased with him. Big scholar in Syria. And when the war broke out in Syria, he kept saying, when the people were going against the government, he said the people shouldn't go against the government. Right? He kept saying the people shouldn't go against the government. He seemed very pro-government, right? But some of my Syrian friends, they say they felt that he felt that the anti-government movement in Syria didn't have enough strength to be successful. And so he took this position not because he was saying the government was okay, but to try to keep the people, you know, from doing something that was going to cause massive bloodshed. And some of the people feel that he was getting to a point where he was feeling like, okay, now the government has gone too far, and was going to begin to find ways to criticize the government. And so what happened? He was killed. He was assassinated. And they say it was from the people fighting the government, but some people say, no, the government killed him because they knew he was getting ready to speak out against the government. So these things are very tricky. And this is why, you know, alhamdulillah, like these are, I'm answering the question because I think it's an important question. But generally speaking, the scholars and our teachers will say, this isn't the kind of work that everyday people should feel they need to be engaged in on their own. Because, you know, and when I say that, yeah, you can protest, you can have an opinion, but like, I'm not going to say, hey, everybody, let's go fight the government. You know what I mean? But the people who have the proper learning, the proper training, and the proper permission, we trust that they'll be able to look at the situation and say, okay, this is what we need in this situation. So like you might have a scholar who's critical of the government, but who will say, everybody stay home, don't protest the government, because they fear that the protest is just going to lead to those protesters getting killed, right? So when is it a situation where it's better to go and say, okay, this government is oppressive, we're going to stand up against the government? That's not something that you can get in a book. That you have to have hikmah. You have to have some wisdom for that, right? So, you know, a scholar may in one situation say, don't oppose the government, just follow them. And the same scholar in a different situation may say, okay, now it's time for us to go and oppose the government, right? So it's tricky. But if people are saying you have to listen to the government, even if they whip you, you know, I've heard this saying before. I tend to feel that it's something people try to use to try to keep people in line, you know. And if you have a way where you can stand up against the oppression of the government, you know, without creating war and bloodshed, I think you have the right to do it. you know, because even if you look at this country, the only reason why things have gotten better than they were 50 years ago, 80 years ago, right, is because people stood up against the government, right? And some of those people were Muslim, right? And, you know, nobody says, oh, they should have just listened to the government that was oppressing people and telling people, you know, you can't go to this school and you can't live here. No, we all say that what they did was good because it made the society better, you know. And so it's the same in a Muslim society, in a majority Muslim society, especially when the ruler is not a Muslim. So that's my opinion. And, you know, alhamdulillah, I can say it here, but I know, you know, it may be dangerous to say it, you know, if you back in your country. So Allah alam, you know, but may Allah make it easy.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for the question. I hope something I said was helpful. That's questions like above my pay grade, but alhamdulillah, it's a good question. Alhamdulillah. Okay, I want to speed through this section that we were reading so that we can get through it, inshallah ta'ala, and we may have time for maybe one more question before we end for the day, inshallah. But the other three categories, we talked about the obligatory innovation, we talked about the haram, unlawful innovation. Now the third category are recommended innovations, bid'ah, mustahab. And the examples that Imam Nawawi gives are things like building hostels and schools of sacred law, recording the research of Islamic schools of legal thought, like the different madhabs, the madahib, writing books on beneficial subjects, whether it be medicine or astronomy or what have you, extensive research into fundamentals and particular applications of sacred law. So things like we're talking about now, like, you know, doing research into Islamic governance, right? Into these kinds of questions. In-depth studies of Arabic linguistics, reciting the weirds, the awrad, having a regular routine of extra dhikr that you do every day. That this is something that the Sufi people are known to do, right? The different dhikrs, adhkar of the Sufi path. Commemorating the birth of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that's celebrating the Mawlid. Wearing your best clothes and rejoicing at it, he mentioned. So, you know, things like, okay, if you have nice clothes, wearing those nice clothes and then praising Allah, you know, for those nice clothes. These are all things that Imam Nawawi mentions as good bid'ah, recommended bid'ah, right? So we could also put into that things like the carpet on the floor when you go into the masjid, or the loudspeaker, the microphone when you call the adhan, or the beads. I have some close by, I'm sure. The beads, the dhikr beads that you use to help you keep count when you do some extra ibadah, extra adhkar. These are all, you know, recommended innovations. Then he goes on to mention the fourth category are innovations that are makruh, that are offensive. So not haram, but things we should still avoid. And he mentioned things like embellishing the mosque. So making the masjid look very extravagant, right? Extravagantly opulent. Decorating the Quran and having a backup person loudly repeat the spoken Allahu Akbar of the Imam if the Imam's voice is already clear and audible to those praying behind him. So he just gives some examples of things that are not haram, but things that were not done by the Prophet ﷺ in the early generations of Muslims that are better if we avoid them, right? And he gives the example of like extravagance, building an extravagant masjid or something like that. And he gives the example, if you go sometimes, like if you go to some Muslim countries, you'll even find like when the Imam says Allahu Akbar, somebody behind him will say Allahu Akbar, right? Like the muadhin or somebody else will repeat what the Imam says so the people behind them can hear him. And even today, like the other day, I was praying in a masjid and the loudspeaker kind of cut off. And so the Imam was saying Allahu Akbar, but everybody couldn't hear him say Allahu Akbar. So this is a situation where if somebody hears the Imam and they repeat Allahu Akbar for the other people praying to hear, right? That's fine. That's good. But here he's saying specifically to do that when you don't need to. If everybody can already hear the Imam, there's no need to have a second person repeat what the Imam is saying. So these are some examples he gives of bid'ah that are makruh. And then the last one he says, The fifth category are innovations that are permissible. So things that are just permissible. They're not halal, they're not haram or anything like that. They're not makruh. And he gives the example of sifting flour, using spoons to eat, right? Seeking out really good food, enjoyable food and drink, or really nice housing. These are things that he's saying, are innovations in that they weren't done during the early generations of Muslims, but there's nothing wrong with doing them. They are permissible. And that is our discussion for today on bid'ah, right? And I wanted to read the definition of makruh. Makruh means disliked, right? Sometimes here they think they translate it as offensive, but makruh means something that's disliked according to the Sharia. And what that means is there a category permissible? But it's like, yes. So when something's makruh, that means it's permissible. When something's makruh, it's not haram, right? If something's haram, that means that if a person does it, they'll be punished for it, right? Unless Allah chooses to forgive them. When something is makruh, they won't be punished for it. It's not haram, but it's better if you don't do it. So if you leave it for the pleasure of Allah, he'll be rewarded. You'll be rewarded for it. So haram is something that if you do, punished for it. Makruh is something that if you leave, you're rewarded for leaving it, but you're not punished for doing it, right? And an example is they give the example here, right, of they say things like alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, jazakumullah khair. Thank you, Auntie, alhamdulillah. But they say here things like having an extravagant masjid, right, would be something that would be considered makruh, right? I'm trying to think of another good example of something that's makruh. I'm drawing a blank, but these are things that are not haram, but they're disliked. So the scholars say we should try to avoid them. Sheikh Amin used to give the example that scholars used to say that smoking cigarettes was makruh, right? They used to say, okay, smoking a cigarette is not haram, but it's makruh. It's better if you avoid it because it's a bad habit, has, makes your breath smell bad. But now the scholars will say it's haram because they've realized that it actually is bad for our health to smoke cigarettes. Like it actually causes lung cancer and things like that. So they say it's haram, right? And there's some scholars like Sheikh Ahmed Tijani, may Allah be pleased with him, who even back when some of the scholars said it was merely makruh, he said it was haram, because he had a different kind of insight. But in any case, that is the end of our discussion for the day. And we're already at almost 10:15. So I'm going to stop there. Next week, and I wanted to have this discussion on bid'ah because I know as more people come, I know this is an important discussion that some of you have heard us, we've had this discussion in the past, but it's something that I like to refresh from time to time, this particular topic, because I know there's a lot of fitna around, people trying to police people's actions in the name of preventing bid'ah. We want to prevent bid'ah. We look at the scholars that we look up to, even these Sufi scholars, right? They were very adamant about the need to fight bid'ah, right? But some people, they think they're fighting bid'ah and they're really just creating fitna because they don't understand that not every innovation falls under the category of the innovations that the Prophet ﷺ was referring to when he told us that the innovations are cursed, right? And it's easy, you see how it's easy for a person who's just reading hadith with no guidance to walk away with that understanding. The hadith says every innovation is haram, right? And leads to the fire, right? But we know from looking at the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and the Tabi'een and the scholarly people from those generations and the generations right after them, that this doesn't mean literally every innovation. If it meant every innovation, then it would mean riding on an airplane. And nobody says that, right? So they say innovations in religion. Okay, but if it meant every innovation in religion, then it will include things like printing the Quran on a printing press. Prophet ﷺ never did that. Sahabas never did that. So not talking about those kind of innovations. So this is where the proper education helps us put these kinds of ahadith into their proper context. Alhamdulillah, someone asked a question in the chat, and I think they had to go, so they'll probably look at the answer on YouTube. So I'll open the floor. As I read this question, I'll open the floor and ask, does anybody have any questions pertaining to what we discussed today, or general questions that you may have? Someone asked, so for clarification, is there no intercession in Islam? No, there is an intercession in Islam. The verse from the Quran in Ayatul Kursi, there's a part of Ayatul Kursi where we say, من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه. Who has the ability to intercede except إلا بإذنه, except by his permission, right? So in other words, nobody has the ability to intercede with Allah except by Allah's permission. It's hadith that let us know that there are some people that Allah will give permission to intercede. For instance, a person who memorizes the Quran, right, will have the ability to intercede for a certain, for some of the people of their family, of their loved ones, right? And there's other traditions that indicate that Allah will give some people the opportunity. The Prophet ﷺ will have the ability to intercede, right? And others, Allah may give the ability to intercede on the Day of Judgment. So there's intercession in Islam, but we recognize that some people from other faith traditions have gone to an extreme where they treat some of their religious leaders as if they have the ability to intercede independent of what Allah say. So like you'll hear, like, and I'm not trying to bash any particular religion because we're taught not to do that. But just to give an example, for instance, in the Catholic faith, right? In the Catholic tradition, if somebody comes and said, I did, these sins, the Catholic Pope, the Catholic cleric, some believe can say, okay, well, say so many Hail Marys, say this prayer, say that prayer, and I absolve you. You have been forgiven, right? We don't believe in that. We believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who forgives. And if he so chooses, he can grant who he chooses of his servants the ability to intercede for others of his servants, right? So we believe in intercession, but we stay guided by the fundamental principle of la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There's no might, no power except by Allah. So the only way anyone could be able to intercede is if Allah gave them that blessed them with that ability. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. And I'll read these questions that someone posted. Alhamdulillah. So someone asked, do voluntary fasts, like the fast of a person who chooses to fast on Monday and Thursday? This is a voluntary fast, a nafila fast that the people used to do, that some people still do, from the sunnah that's referred to in the sources of the sunnah. Does this fast count as a nafila ibadah for those who have salat to make up? Yes. The fasting and the salat are not connected like that. If a person owes prayers, they have the right to make extra fast, even if they're still working to make up those prayers, right? Same with other acts of nafila ibadah. A person who owes prayers, they shouldn't say, well, I owe prayers, so there's no point in me trying to learn Quran and recite Quran because I got to make up my prayers first. No, you have the right to learn Quran and recite Quran, but you also have to make sure that you make time to consistently, work toward making up your prayers as well. The second question they asked is, what is the etiquette for leaving the prayer line if you are not in the back or in spot? How should you pass others if you need to step out of the line? So this is a good question. Let's say, for instance, you're making salah, you're praying Jumu'ah, and you break wind, you pass gas, right? It's no sin. This is something that Allah placed upon you, right? Now you have to go and make wudu and come back to the prayer. How do you do it? You just walk through the line. You can't walk in front of the imam, but the imam counts as what is called a sutra, a sort of covering for everybody praying behind him. So if I'm standing in line, I got somebody to the right of me, somebody to the left of me, and I break wind. Now I need to get out of the line so I can go make wudu. I have the right to walk in front of the people who are standing in line with me, right? I even have the right to, if I need to sort of step back, I can walk in front of the people that are behind me, right? You can walk through the rows, but you just can't pass the imam. So, inshallah, I hope that answers that question. Sister Zainab, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I just had a quick question. Is there, when you have to make up fast, is there a cutoff date before Ramadan? Like you can't make up days like in Shaban or?
No, make them up. Yeah, you make them up. Say the last part again.
I was just saying, or is it all the way up until, like the day before?
It's all the way up until the day before. And then if you owe fast from Ramadan and you don't make them up before the next Ramadan, then you got to make them up after that Ramadan. Like any fast that you missed on Ramadan without a valid excuse, you got to make up. And that stays with you in perpetuity. So yeah, you can make them up any day other than a day during Ramadan.
Okay, thank you.
And other than the Eid, you shouldn't fast on the Eid, even if you have days to make up.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum. Sidi Yahya. What's going on, Uncle?
Alaikum salam to barakatuh. I think this should be a short question, but the alcohol that they put in a lot of products, if you get this on your clothes or anything like that, would this damage your prayer?
Alhamdulillah. So you mean alcohol that's put in products for your skin and stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not considered najis. That's a totally different type of alcohol than the alcohol that people drink to get drunk. So if you get alcohol, like rubbing alcohol or alcohol that's put inside of a skin product, something like that on your clothes, that's totally fine. And even if you were to get like, say the vanilla extract that has a little bit of alcohol in it, right? They say that because it's not like the vanilla is not something that people drink to get intoxicated. And the purpose of the alcohol in it is it's kind of an elaborate explanation they have, but basically the scholars say that doesn't count as liquor, right? That doesn't count as alcohol that you drink. So if you have like the vanilla, you can put that in your food. If it gets on your clothes, it's no problem. Now, if it's like the rum that they put in the rum cake, that's not just, that's haram. You can't eat it, right? But these things that have trace amounts of alcohol that aren't, the reason for the alcohol is not for somebody to get drunk. Like you can't drink vanilla until you get drunk, right? Then the scholars say that they don't count as alcohol.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah, you made my wife kind of happy because we've been trying to avoid the vanilla over here.
Yep, I did too for a long time.
She smiled in the background. I don't know, man. And we went, and because certain things, especially when you cook, and I'm not gonna hold you, gotta go, but certain things when you cook, you want to put that flavor in it because you need that flavor. If you don't put it in it, it's just not gonna be. And
they say that intention is one of the things they take into account when they decide whether or not it's permissible, right? So the intention is not for alcohol. The intention is for the flavor of the vanilla, right? And it's not something that would intoxicate you. Now, if your intention was to get the flavor, but this thing was going to get you drunk, it would be haram. Or if you had some kind of, I don't even know how this would work, but if there was something that couldn't get you drunk, but you used it to try to get drunk, this also would be haram. But because the intention is not to get intoxicated, and it's not something that would actually get you intoxicated, they say that it's permissible.
Yeah, the intention. Alhamdulillah. Okay, jazakallah khairan.
Wa iyaka. Alhamdulillah. Brother Hassan, assalamu alaikum, Uncle. See you got your hand up.
Assalamu alaikum. This is a rather, this question right here probably requires a longer answer than you have time for, but I'm asking it anyway. This morning at Fajr, after I finished my salat, after I finished the salat, my wife said, "You didn't make ruku, right? In the last rakat, you didn't make ruku," and I said, "Oh wow, did I make it? I didn't. I wasn't sure whether or not I made the ruku or not." So I said, "Oh wow, since I already slammed out, I said, all right, I'll do the prayer over again." But as I was doing the prayer over again, I remembered that I made the ruku. Right. I didn't remember at the time she said that I didn't make it, but when I began the prayer again, I remembered that I made ruku. I continued on with the prayer. So this is where the mix-up was. All right. And I wanted to ask you about this because we discussed this, I think, a few weeks ago, where we talked about the qunut in the prayer. The qunut in the prayer comes in the last rakat after you do your ruku. Is that correct?
So that's 3 questions, and I'm gonna try to answer all of them. First, the qunut can be done before ruku or after. They're both permissible. It's better to do it before you make ruku.
Okay.
Better to do it before you make ruku. But if you make it after ruku, that's fine. Like me, if I forget to make it before ruku, then I'll make it after ruku.
Okay.
Right? So you have the right to do either one, but it's better to do before ruku. That's 1. 2, if you make a mistake in prayer, you shouldn't pray over again, especially you, because you've been taking these lessons, right? So what you do is you fix the prayer. So in that case, instead of standing up to say, I'm going to make a whole new Salatul Subh, you should stand up to say, I'm going to make a new rakah, 1 rakah, for the rakah that I missed. Or to make up for the rakah that is canceled because it didn't have a ruku in it.
All right.
Follow me?
Yes.
So your wife says you didn't make ruku. I didn't? Oh, okay. You stand right up, make takbir, make 1 full rakah, and then make sujood saw after salams. Why? For all the extra motions that you added. That rakat, that was an incomplete rakat. That's a bunch of extra motions. That moment to talk with your wife, where she said, you didn't make ruku. I didn't. All of that extra stuff, to make up for that, you make sujood saw after salams. You got that?
Right. So the one thing was, this is the one thing. I had already finished the salat.
Yeah.
I had already finished the salat and salammed out.
That's fine.
Okay.
You still stand up. The only way you would have to make the whole prayer over again is if you got up and went away, did something else. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
And some significant time had passed. But if it was just you salamed out, and then right after you salamed out, your wife said you didn't make ruku, you still just stand up and make that 1 rakah. You don't have to. I'm sorry, I muted you by accident. Brother Hassan, I muted you by you don't have to stand up and make a whole new prayer. You just stand up and make 1 new rakah to make up for the rakat with the missing ruku. You follow me?
Alhamdulillah. Yes, I follow you.
Alhamdulillah.
I follow you. And then afterwards, make the sujood for forgetfulness.
After salams, yes. And then the third question that I'm taking from what you asked is, what happens when you, like, let's say you stand up to make that new rakah, and you remember while you're making that new rakah that you already did ruku, right? So in this case, you if you're by yourself, so in this case, that the prayer is valid, right? The prayer is valid, right? But if you have some unsurety, you can still finish that new rakat that you started and make sujood saw after salams to be safe, right? Okay. But if you know for sure that you made the ruku, then you can stop because your salat is valid, All
right.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Or actually, if you started making a new rakah because you said, okay, I think I might have missed the ruku, so let me make this new rakah. and you say Allahu Akbar and you start to pray, right? If you remember before you go into ruku, then I would probably stop and say, oh, okay, my prayer is valid. Or you could continue praying and add a second rak'ah to it. Or if you don't remember that you made the ruku until after you make the ruku of this new rak'ah, then you add a rak'ah to it. Why? Because now you're respecting the form of the prayer and you're just making 2 rak'ah nafila. So once you remember that you made ruku, you say, okay, well, I can treat this as a nafila. I started praying. Let me continue 2 quick rak'ah so that I get the benefit of making nafila rather than just leaving the prayer when I've already started, with the intention of doing it. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It makes sense. However, I have another question, because when you do that, even that's after the Fajr prayer, right?
Yeah.
And normally there are no rakats after the Fajr prayer until we have Isra, until the sun rises.
Yep. That's true.
Okay, but I would continue on and do the nafila anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. I probably would, okay. but I don't know. That's a question that we should ask Sheikh Amino. We should ask Sheikh Maya.
That's satisfactory for me.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah.
Say the Asma. I see you got your hand up.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Quick question. I'm learning surahs, and I find I have a lot of time driving, and also like treadmill, like I may be on the treadmill for an hour. Do I need wudu if I'm studying a line? Like I use an app and I recite behind it.
Yep.
Do I need wudu to do that?
Allahumma salli wa sallam. This is a little tricky, and this will be the last question, inshallah. This is a little tricky. So I'm gonna give you an answer that I'm gonna answer a different question that's not so tricky, and then we'll try to come back to your question. Now, do you need wudu to recite the Quran? No. Do you need wudu to touch the Quran? Yes. What if you're a student studying the Quran? Then an exception is made for you if you're sitting with the teacher's giving you your lesson, you don't have wudu or you lose wudu, you're not required to go get up and make wudu every time you lose it because you're studying it. So you can touch the Quran even though you don't have wudu in that respect. It's still good if you do make wudu, but technically you have the right to, touch the Quran without wudu as a student who's studying with the teacher, right? Because maybe the teacher only has 10 minutes to give you your lesson. And so you need to take advantage of that 10 minutes, and get your lesson. And then when the lesson's over, you put the Quran down, go make your wudu if you want to keep reviewing. You follow me?
Yes.
So now the reason I say it's tricky is because you said you follow behind an app. So if the app doesn't require you to touch the words of the Quran, then yes, you're fine. You can recite, you can memorize, you can listen to it without wudu, right? But if it's an app where you have to actually touch the letters of the Quran, I find this, when I've heard scholars try to answer this question, they always kind of like, we don't know, because does this count as the mushaf, right? If the app is on your phone, right? I treat it as, if the app is open, I treat it like the book of the Quran, and I try to make sure I don't touch the letters without wudu, right? But when the app is closed, you take your phone in the bathroom, you know what I mean? So when you start talking about apps and phones, that's kind of one of those areas where there's a lot of difference of opinion and people kind of shy away from it. I would say if you can use the app without touching it, then sure. You can do it without wudu. But if you have to touch the screen when the words of the Quran are visible, then I would wait till I could make wudu.
Okay, so actually it plays in the car, and I just hit play. I don't have to touch any Quran or anything. I just hit play, and I put it on repeat, and I can just listen to that same ayat over and over.
I think that's totally fine.
Okay.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Alhamdulillah. That's a good question. Alhamdulillah.
Jazakallah khair.
Wa iyaka, jazakumullah khair. Alhamdulillah. And we'll go ahead and close out there for the day. I don't think anybody has any questions on YouTube. If anybody has any questions on YouTube, then, type them right now. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. That's my dad. Alhamdulillah. Thank you, Dad. I appreciate that, Dad. Alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khair. Jazakumullah khair. Alhamdulillah. My dad, my first teacher. Alhamdulillah. May Allah reward you. Alhamdulillah. Inshallah, we're going to close out. Please, everybody, keep me and my father and my family and my teachers in your dua. Jazakumullah khair. May Allah bless and protect and forgive and reward all of you, all of us. بجاه رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من فتنة المحيا والممات ومن فتنة القبر ومن فتنة المسيح الدجال ومن عذاب النار وسوء المصير. اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من الهم والحزن ونعوذ بك من العجز والكسل ونعوذ بك من الجبن والبخل ونعوذ بك من غضبة الدين وقهر الرجال. Oh our Lord, we seek thy refuge from anxiety and grief. We seek thy refuge from lack of strength and laziness. We seek thy refuge from cowardliness and niggardliness. And we seek thy refuge from debt and the oppression of people. Bijay Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this dua is a dua that I encourage people to say often, because in our times, all of these problems are problems that are rampant. Anxiety and grief, depression, anxiety, these are big problems that many people, including many Muslims, including very knowledgeable Muslims with good character, struggle with depression and anxiety, lack of strength and laziness. This is infirmity, with regard to like health problems. All of that is covered in lack of strength. And then laziness, of course, is something that, is an issue, with something that we seek refuge in Allah from. Cowardliness and miserliness, right? Niggardliness, stinginess, right? These are things that we have to ask Allah to protect us from, so that we can be successful in our affairs. Like my father used to tell me growing up, Allah doesn't bless the coward, so we pray Allah bless us to be people who have faith in him, because having faith in him is a part of being courageous, and being courageous is a part of having faith in Allah. And of course, we seek that refuge from debt and oppression. And we live in a time where debt slavery is rampant and all forms of oppression are rampant. So we make this dua, and I encourage everybody to learn this dua, inshallah, if you don't know it. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina Muhammadin al-Fatih lima ughliq wal khatim lima sabaq an-nasir wal hadi ala siratik al-mustaqim wa ala alihi haqqa qadrihi al-azim subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Assalamu alaikum Jamaat. Inshallah, we speak soon. I see you next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Shukran.
F1.